He was a prophet, called, chosen by God, yet the heavens remained silent. For 3 years, not a single drop of rain had fallen. Trees withered, rivers disappeared, children cried, their lips cracked from thirst, and Elijah walked alone, carrying a burden no one else could see. How do you trust when heaven remains shut? How do you carry on when even your faith seems to dry up along with the earth? How many times have you felt this way? How often have you prayed, waited, and heard only silence in reply? Today, we'll relive one of the most dramatic moments in all biblical history, the day one man faced this same silence, challenged an entire nation, and saw fire fall from heaven, a story of faith, spiritual confrontation, and divine intervention that changed everything. He had confronted kings, he had challenged idolatry, but now he walked with a weary soul and a fear he himself tried to hide. The people of Israel were divided. Some had already bowed to foreign gods. Others were just trying to survive, unsure of whom to believe. King Ahab was drowning in idolatry. Jezebel spread terror, slaughtering the Lord's prophets. And in the midst of this chaos was Elijah, hidden, surviving with very little, sustained only by a promise that seemed more distant each passing day. He had been fed by ravens, he had been sustained by a foreign widow, yet he still carried the same doubt many of us know all too well. Will God still act? The invitation to confrontation had been issued, a public challenge, a duel between the God of Israel and gods made of stone and wood. The location? Mount Carmel. The audience? An entire nation, tired, divided, desperately longing for an answer. Elijah knew that if God didn't respond, it would be the last day of his life. Every step toward the mountain was a step against fear, every breath an internal battle. Because more than facing the prophets of Baal, Elijah had to confront his own heart. And if today you also find yourself wrestling with the silence of God, this story is for you. Because before fire comes faith. Before an answer comes the choice to press on, even when you don't understand. The wind continued to carry dust across Carmel as the first curious onlookers drew near. Elijah walked toward the center of the mountain, the precise spot where an entire nation's eyes would soon be fixed. Each step seemed driven by an invisible weight. It wasn't just the risk of public failure, it was the feeling of fighting for a God who until now remained silent. The prophet stopped, looking around at confused faces. Men with heads bowed, women in silence, children with distant eyes. Among them stood the 450 prophets of Baal, dressed brightly and adorned with pagan symbols, positioning themselves with confidence that seemed to grow stronger by the moment. King Ahab observed from afar, wearing the look of someone expecting a spectacle. Jezebel wasn't there, but her shadow lingered in the air, as if the very atmosphere breathed idolatry. Elijah took a deep breath. His knees trembled, not from fatigue, but from fear he was struggling to hide even from himself. Right there, in that instant, a question tore through his inner silence. What if heaven doesn't respond? What if I've misunderstood everything? But stepping back was no longer an option. So Elijah raised his voice, turned to the people and, as recorded in the first book of Kings, posed a question that would echo throughout the ages. How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, then follow him. His words sliced through the air like a blade, but the people remained silent. No applause, no shout of support, only silence, a silence more painful than any answer. And perhaps that same choice still echoes today. If you believe that even when heaven seems silent, choosing God's side still matters, leave your like and subscribe now. This helps YouTube understand that this message must reach more people, because stories like this need to be told until the end. Elijah proposed the challenge: 2 altars, 2 bulls, no fire. The God who responded would be recognized as the true God. The prophets of Baal immediately accepted. It was exactly what they wanted, a chance to prove their God had power. The altar was built, the wood arranged, the bull prepared. The men started dancing around, shouting loudly, calling on Baal's name. Hours passed, and nothing happened. The sun climbed higher, yet the altar remained untouched. Heat streamed down the stones, a constant reminder that time was against them all. Elijah watched silently. Inside, his heart was a battlefield. On the outside, he maintained the composure of a man who still believed. But with each scream from the prophets, tension grew heavier. In the middle of that scene, while pagans danced, bled, and pleaded, Elijah took a few steps back. He closed his eyes, letting his mind wander back through the days of silence he'd endured. He remembered the cave, the widow, the ravens, everything that had sustained him until now felt distant, like memories of someone else's life. In that moment, he realized the battle there wasn't just against Baal. It was against doubt, against fear, and against his own spiritual solitude. And as the sun began to set, the prophets' cries turned to desperation. They cut themselves with knives, their blood flowing in a frenzied attempt to provoke a response. Yet heaven remained motionless. No cloud, no sound, no divine intervention. Elijah drew another deep breath, and for the first time allowed himself a smile. It wasn't mocking. It was the smile of someone who began remembering that the God of Israel didn't need human performance to act. But before he took the next step, before walking toward the altar, he issued a taunt that would be remembered forever. "Shout louder! Perhaps your God is busy, or traveling, or perhaps he's sleeping." The people, who until now had merely observed, started exchanging glances. Something was changing. A new tension filled the air. And in Elijah's heart, even under the weight of silence, certainty emerged. God's moment was still to come. The afternoon wore on, and Mount Carmel turned into a scene of chaos and frustration. The prophets of Baal, exhausted, stumbled around the altar. Their clothing was torn, their bodies marked by deep wounds, and their voices, once filled with confidence, now sounded like hoarse whispers, lost in the dust. They had danced, cried out, wounded their own bodies, all to gain the attention of a God who simply did not answer. The ground, stained with blood, bore witness to a desperation that had long since crossed the line of reason. The people who had watched with anticipation now stared in silence. In their eyes was disbelief, shame, and a growing sense of unease. Some men covered their faces, no longer wanting to watch. Women embraced their children with teary eyes, while younger people exchanged glances, as if finally recognizing the deception unfolding before them. The sun slowly descended, painting the sky shades of orange and red. Yet even as colors shifted on the horizon, no cloud appeared, no thunder, no sign, nothing but echoes of their own screams bouncing back, a cruel reminder of the lack of response. Elijah remained silent. He didn't step forward, he didn't taunt, he didn't smile, he simply observed. His eyes moved across the altar, the prophets, and each face in the crowd. He saw the collective exhaustion, the disillusionment starting to take shape, and faith in Baal crumbling stone by stone within every heart. The sound of knives tearing flesh had faded. The men, once so frenzied, now dragged themselves around the altar like shadows of who they once were. Some fell to the ground, unable to stand again. Others attempted one last cry, but their voices refused to cooperate. A young boy in the crowd whispered to his father, "Do you think Baal is angry with us?" The father did not answer. He simply lowered his head, unable to look his son in the eyes. As the afternoon dragged on, the weight of spiritual failure became increasingly visible. The altar remained untouched, the wood dry, the bull undisturbed, the sky motionless. Inside Elijah, his heart pounded, not dominated by fear anymore, but by a different kind of pain. The pain of seeing a people so close yet so far from the truth. Even still, he restrained himself. It wasn't yet time to act. What was happening there needed to run its course, painful, visible, impossible to interrupt prematurely. The prophet's clamor, which had filled the mountain for hours, now dwindled to groans, ragged breaths, and a silence beginning to take hold over Carmel. The crowd, previously mere spectators, now stood torn between embarrassment and restless curiosity. It was in this moment of collective spiritual collapse that Elijah took a step back, fixed his eyes upon the altar, and inwardly prepared himself. The hour of response was drawing near, but before that could happen, heaven needed to remain silent until the very last cry faded away. The silence that settled over Mount Carmel felt almost physical. Where once loud cries had echoed, now there reigned a restrained anticipation. Every eye turned toward Elijah, who walked slowly toward the scattered stones, remnants of an ancient altar forgotten by the nation. Without saying a word, he began gathering them one by one. His hands steady, his gaze determined, but his heart weighed down with memories. Elijah knew that each stone carried the history of one tribe of Israel. 12 tribes, 12 promises, 12 covenants with the God who now seemed ready to speak again. As the prophet arranged the altar, the people watched with a mixture of curiosity and awe. There was no music, no dancing, no blood spilled, only the sound of stones being placed, as if, with every touch, Elijah was rebuilding not just an altar, but Israel's very spiritual identity. Around him, no one dared break the silence. Some men covered their faces with their hands. Women held their children close, as though wanting to protect them from something they couldn't yet name. The prophet dug a trench around the altar, a simple act, yet full of meaning. Every detail seemed to defy human logic, as if Elijah wanted to remove any doubt that when fire came, it would indeed be a divine intervention. Looking at the people, Elijah lifted his voice, and for the first time that day he spoke not of confrontation, but of restoration. Recalling the words recorded in the first book of Kings, he made sure to explain that the 12 stones represented the 12 tribes, Israel, whom God had called by name, and who now needed to remember who they were. Elijah called for water, and more water. 3 times he drenched the wood, the altar, even the trench around it. The liquid flowed down, forming tiny streams amidst the dust. It was a challenge to logic, a provocation to physics, and a public declaration of faith. The people watched in absolute silence. The expectation was no longer about who would win. Now, everyone wanted to know if Elijah's God would still answer, if he was still there, if he still listened. Elijah stepped back just enough to see the entire altar. He drew a deep breath, and at that moment time seemed suspended. Memories of the days of famine, the ravens, the widow, the cave, all flashed through his mind like lightning. The prophet knelt down, and with a simple prayer began speaking to the God of Israel. He didn't ask for himself. He didn't seek personal honor. He didn't shout. He didn't repeat words. He didn't use dramatic gestures. He simply opened his heart. "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so that these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." The words, so similar to what is written in chapter 18 of the first book of Kings, came out as a whisper, but with a weight that seemed to tear through the very air. The people listened in silence. Each syllable seemed to carry centuries of promises, of covenants, of mercy. And at that instant, while water still trickled down and the altar remained untouched, a new kind of waiting took form. No longer a waiting born of doubt, but of hope. Elijah remained on his knees, eyes fixed on the heavens, his heart on the edge of an invisible cry. And as the final echo of the prayer lingered in the air, a force, until then imperceptible, began shifting the atmosphere over Carmel. The moment no one expected was about to happen. The silence hovering over Mount Carmel was so profound, it seemed even the wind hesitated to pass. The newly rebuilt altar remained drenched. Water dripped down the stones, soaking the earth, forming small streams that flowed toward the people, as if all creation itself was waiting for the conclusion of that day. Elijah stayed on his knees. The people, in total silence, fixed their eyes on him. There was no music, no spectacle, just one man and a prayer about to be spoken. He took a deep breath and began to speak. He did not shout. He did not wave his arms. He did not draw out his words. His plea was direct, intimate, and full of truth. Elijah did not ask for glory, not for fame, not for recognition. His only desire was that the heart of the people would return to God. O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back to you. His words, so closely mirroring the record in chapter 18 of the first book of Kings, came forth with a force that seemed to shatter the invisible barriers between heaven and earth. And then, before the echo of the prayer had even faded, it happened. The sky, which until then had remained thick with silence, split open with an explosion of light. A flame descended, as though a piece of eternal glory had pierced the clouds, tearing through the air, striking the altar with supernatural fury. The fire consumed everything: the water-soaked wood, the sacrifice, the stones, the water collected in the trench, even the surrounding soil. In seconds, the altar, once a symbol of rebuilt faith, became a monument of divine intervention. The people who moments before stood wavering between doubt and hope now fell face down upon the ground. Men, women, children, all in unison began shouting, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" It was as if centuries of idolatry, skepticism, and indifference had been shattered in that single instant. The weight of doubt was replaced with collective recognition that, even after so much silence, God still spoke, God still saw, God still answered. Elijah stood, face turned toward heaven. There was no victory smile, no look of superiority, only deep relief and silent gratitude from a man who knew that, once again, God had honored his own word. The fire continued burning in the memories of everyone who watched, but the most important flame had been ignited within each heart present that day. While the people remained prostrate, Elijah stepped forward. His gaze met the prophets of Baal, now in shock, frozen, unable to speak or flee. Their spiritual humiliation was complete, not by human words, but by an unquestionable display of the sovereignty of the God of Israel. In that moment, a new spiritual chapter began for Israel. Idolatry, which for so long had seduced the heart of the nation, had now been exposed, defeated, and burned before everyone's eyes. The sound of the fire slowly faded, but the memory of that moment would remain forever. And Elijah knew that, despite that victory, his mission was not yet over. Because after the fire would come the rain, and after the rain would come persecution. But in that moment, the prophet chose simply to give silent thanks. God had answered. Smoke still rose from the consumed altar, but Elijah was already looking toward the horizon. The people's cries, their shouts of recognition, were beginning to fade, giving way to a new kind of silence. It wasn't the silence of doubt, nor the silence of God's absence. It was the silence of those who, at last, waited for the next step. The prophet, his face still marked by the tension of the confrontation, turned to Ahab. His voice, firm, yet without arrogance, delivered a new command: "Go up, eat and drink, for there is the sound of heavy rain." The king, still stunned by what he had just witnessed, did not hesitate. As Ahab descended the mountain, Elijah climbed higher, making his way to the top of Carmel. There, he knelt, placing his face between his knees in a posture that blended exhaustion, reverence, and a spiritual urgency he himself could barely explain. The sky remained clear, no clouds, no wind, but Elijah knew the cycle of drought was about to end. The prophet called for his servant and, in a low but determined voice, said, "Go up and look toward the sea." The young man ran to the highest point, looked out, and returned, head down. Nothing. Elijah stayed still. This wasn't the first time he had prayed for something impossible. It wasn't the first time he stood in the gap between promise and fulfillment. Without opening his eyes, he simply repeated, "Go back and look again." The servant went and returned, again and again. 7 times, Elijah insisted. 7 times. The young man climbed up and came back down, always bringing the same answer. Nothing yet. But on the 7th time, the servant returned with a different look, breathless, words tumbling over themselves in haste. He said, "There's a cloud, small, about the size of a man's hand, rising from the sea." Those few words were enough for Elijah to rise with a surge of renewed faith. He knew that in God's cycle, everything starts small, but carries within it the power to transform. Elijah then said to his servant, "Go to Ahab and tell him to prepare his chariot and go down before the rain stops him." Down below, Ahab was already preparing to depart. The king, who still understood little of Elijah's heart, probably saw that small cloud as nothing more than an interesting weather change, but the prophet felt deep within his spirit that something monumental was about to happen. As the first winds began to blow, the sky started changing color. The pale blue gave way to a heavy gray, dense, as if the sky itself were bowing down, preparing to pour onto the earth what had been held back for years. And then an even more unexpected sign appeared. Elijah, filled with a strength he himself could not explain, tucked his cloak into his belt and began to run, not at a slow pace, not like a tired man, but like someone driven by supernatural vigor. He overtook Ahab's chariot, running ahead for miles across the road leading to Jezreel. It was as though God, in that very moment, had not only opened the heavens with rain, but had also filled Elijah's body with strength from above. That run, far beyond any physical feat, became a living metaphor. After prayer comes action. After waiting comes movement. After the fire comes the rain. And after the promise comes fulfillment. As the first drops began to fall, soaking the thirsty ground, Elijah ran, not just toward a city, but toward the next chapter of his mission, and, unknowingly, toward the beginning of a persecution that would alter the course of his story forever. The first drops of rain still marked the ground when Elijah reached the gates of Jezreel, his body exhausted, yet sustained by a strength that only faith could explain. In his mind, the echo of all that had just happened, the fire, the answered prayer, the rain that ended the drought, and the restoration beginning to take root in Israel's heart. But before the prophet could even breathe in peace, news traveled faster than the storm. Jezebel, upon hearing Ahab's account of Mount Carmel, did not respond with repentance, nor with fear. Her answer was a direct threat, charged with fury, and a promise of death. "May the gods deal with me, and ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not take Elijah's life, just as he took the lives of Baal's prophets." The sentence shot through the gates like an invisible arrow, striking Elijah with a force that neither fire nor drought nor the silence of God had ever provoked before. The same man who had stood against an entire nation, who had prayed until heaven opened, who had outrun Ahab's chariot, now fled, not from lack of faith, but from a fear that, in that moment, felt larger than everything. And as Elijah ran, the wind from the new storm whipped against his face, as if God himself was still there, even in the midst of the flight. Mount Carmel had been the stage of an eternal confrontation between faith and idolatry, between silence and response, between doubt and divine intervention. And even with fear, the truth remained. The God who answered with fire and then with rain was still in control. If this story spoke to your heart, if you believe that even after a miracle, it's still worth standing on God's side, leave your like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to remember the same God of Carmel is still God, even on days of fear and uncertainty.